In the last days of session, Illinois lawmakers voted to abolish the death penalty and raise taxes. That's next on CapitolVIew. Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of CapitolVIew, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Mike Lawerence, longtime Statehouse reporter and former spokesperson for Governor Edgar. Mike, thanks for coming.
Good to be here.
Kevin McDermott, Statehouse bureau chief for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Kevin, thanks for being here. Thank you. And Chris Wetterich, Statehouse reporter for the State Journal-Register. Chris, thanks for coming.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's been a big week, guys. We're all a little sleep deprived. Let's start off with that tax increase. I'd like to talk, first, it's a little complicated. I'd like to lay out just what's in it. Chris, can you tell me a little bit about how the rates changed?
Sure. It's an income tax increase. It would take the individual rate that Illinoisans pay from 3% to 5%, and it would take the corporate income tax rate from, I believe it was 4.8% to 7%. And that was the main parts of it. It's different from a tax increase that the Senate passed about a year and a half ago, which also affected sales taxes. And they're hoping that this will put a big dent in the budget deficit that they have.
And those rates aren't permanent, Kevin?
No, they'll drop back, not to their pre-hike level, but they'll drop back significantly after 4 years, supposedly. Now, this happened once before, as Mike could tell you, where they were supposed to drop back and a decision was made to keep them in place, which obviously, that could be on the table as well.
Mm-hmm. And Republicans are kind of arguing there's built-in caps for those 4 years meant to target the deficit, but Republicans are kind of arguing that growth may cause.
Well, they're saying it's a guaranteed growth. I mean, if you start out your budget saying, and we're going to give ourselves, 2% a year, mm-hmm. The notion of them not taking that 2% a year would be a little surprising. Obviously, they're basically saying we're going to take that. That was the Republican argument, that you're setting up an automatic increase every year. Now, on the flip side of that argument is, did they really think there wasn't going to be an increase from year to year?
And at least there's a cap on that increase for now.
And the Democrats also argue that the increase is going to consist of increased Medicaid spending, which is almost unavoidable given the health care costs in this country, and also increased pension growth, which is required by law. There was a 1995 law that was passed, and it required a spike in pension payments over the last decade or so, and that's going to continue. So there's no way around it, and the Democrats argue that by passing this tax increase, they will no longer have to borrow money to pay the pensions as they have for many of the last couple of fiscal years, over the last decade. They repeatedly borrowed money or skipped the pension payment.
And there's an interesting caveat in those caps. If legislators were to spend money beyond them, then the tax increase would basically go away. Is this going to be something that's really effective to keep them in line, or will they just go back in and change the caps?
Well, they could change the statute, too, to take away that penalty. This is by law. It's not in the Constitution. So if they got into a situation where they wanted or had to increase spending beyond the cap, they can go back and amend the law.
Now, there is a caveat in the rules that they changed, that it will take a 3/5 vote to go in and change the law. Do you think both parties would be willing to take the pain there if it was necessary?
Well, it's hard to project the future. My main point is it's not in granite. I mean, you just, after watching the process as long as I have, you learn that nothing is for sure.
Are you suggesting they would change the rules as they go along in the legislature?
Well, that's what made
ever happens.
That's what made it into the plan. There were a lot of pieces that did not make it in. There was a lot of negotiation and horse trading going on. One of the biggest parts was probably a borrowing plan. Kevin, can you talk a little bit to what that was?
Essentially, a lot of this comes down to the governor's, well, not just the governor, but everybody's concern that they wouldn't be able to borrow anymore because the state of our fiscal house, as he puts it, was such a mess that we were going to be, our interest rates were going to be too high. I'm kind of intrigued actually by the politics of this. I mean, Governor Quinn goes into his very first day, literally, of his first elective term, finally with this victory that he's been trying to get for 2 years. I'm wondering how this is going to play out in the next election and whether, Democrats are going to be made to pay for it. And I think a lot of it comes down to whether the borrowing plan and all the other components of this work. I mean, if he can point in 2 years back to this and say all of this worked, this was the right thing to do, and it didn't hurt anybody that much, I think he might actually be able to pull this out.
You wrote on the borrowing plan for the SJR. Can you kind of flesh out what the concept is behind it?
Well, the idea is that the state has well over $5 billion in unpaid bills. The borrowing plan would borrow enough to deal with those bills. The governor called it yesterday, I believe it was a debt restructuring, rather than, he wants to avoid using the word borrow. And the plan basically failed in the House, and the House adjourned without giving the Senate any opportunity to go back and kind of work on it. So basically, I think that the Republicans plan to use that as leverage in the coming session to get some of the things that they want, which include workers' comp reform. They want tort reform. That's always been an issue, and the Supreme Court recently struck down medical malpractice caps, so that's an issue that they want to return to. So there are some things that the Republicans want that they think they can leverage out of this borrowing plan.
Well, and part of the reason they're or selling it as a restructuring idea is that it would possibly save us money on interest in the long run, because when we miss our payments, we pay a pretty high interest rate for that. Mike, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Well, I just wanted to go back for a moment to the tax increase. A lot of us have felt for several years now that they needed to step up and do something. They've been borrowing on top of borrowing. They've continued to spend more than they've taken in. We've seen the deficit grow substantially. So the context for this, and I'm sure there are a lot of people upset over it, is that something had to be done. Kevin referred to issues regarding the state's ability to borrow. Now, this started out as a fiscal cold, a budgetary cold, back in 2002, 2003, and it's turned into potentially lethal pneumonia because they haven't stepped up. And as often happens in health situations, if you ignore something, it costs a lot more to take care of it down the road.
So financial Ebola is what it is.
Well, and you made the point that people have been calling for this for a while. Barbara Flynn Curry said in the committee hearing, she's the sponsor of the tax increase, that most reasonable watchers of state government have said we need some kind of new revenue. Yet, this is getting hit really hard in the press. Is this the plan that Illinois needed?
Well, I don't think it was. I mean, I'm going to give credit to Governor Quinn and the legislative leaders, the Democrat leaders, for at least doing something here and doing something significant. I don't think it's the best plan. I don't think there was a need to raise the rate on the income tax as high as it was raised. There were alternatives. Chris referred to legislation that the Senate had passed last year, which would have broadened the sales tax base to include services. We don't tax retirement benefits in Illinois. We're the only state that levies an income tax that does not tax retirement benefits. And so there was a potential to raise that revenue without increasing the income tax rate quite so substantially. And there was a potential to provide even more revenue, because I believe that as steep as those increases were, I don't think they're enough to avoid deficits down the road. And we're just going to have to come to grips with the fact that we're going to have to reform our tax structure in Illinois. We're going to have to look at spending a lot more closely. I mean, limits sound good, freezes sound even better, and cuts sound terrific to some people. But the fact of the matter is, unless you really look at spending, examine it closely, figure out what you need, what you might not need, you don't really have a long-term proposal, or a long-term plan, rather, for the future.
Well, and with the size of the problem, I think it's pretty clear to everybody that nobody will say this because you really can't sell this to the public. There really is no way to solve this problem other than to stop the bleeding until the economy comes around. That's the only thing that's going to solve the problem. And I think we saw that in the last election where Bill Brady, the Republican candidate, could not be pegged down on what he would do other than to use the old cliche about going through the budget line by line as if there's $15 billion in there that somebody didn't notice or something. But this was always pretty clearly a way of saying, look, we're gonna tread water until the economy comes around. That will fix everything. But I think Mike's right. We weren't paying our bills, and this was going to get bad. This was going to get to we did a story about lights literally being turned off in state offices, which it sounds like a bad joke.
And people were behind on payments for state offices.
Well, yeah.
getting ready to
These
get
are
kicked
the
out.
legislative offices were having their utilities cut off because they have to get in line like everyone else, and they weren't getting paid. And that's just an example of how bad it's gotten.
And not to belabor this, but if the economy does come back, Illinois has a flat rate income tax, so it does not grow revenues as quickly as states that have a graduated income tax. So, and if we're not going to tax services, if we're not going to tax retirement benefits, we will get more revenue, but we're not going to get enough revenue out of our current tax structure to meet, I think, essential demands in Illinois.
I think Mike's totally right. This plan really throttles the middle class and poor people because there is no cushion for them. There is no additional exemption for low-income people as there was in the governor's original tax increase plan back in, I think it was 2009, and it doesn't broaden the sales tax base. There was a plan that Dan Hines, the state controller, had in the 2010 primary that he ran against Governor Quinn on that would have raised not quite as much revenue, I don't think, but pretty close to it. But it would have required a constitutional amendment to allow the state to have a graduated income tax. I wonder if they don't start to look at these issues, given that they've given themselves 4 years now, and try to come up with a little bit more rational tax structure, because Illinois' taxes, we're heavily dependent on property taxes for schools. It's a highly regressive tax state that we have, and I wonder if they don't use this opportunity to take a look at that.
Well, to be fair to Quinn on Heinz's plan, he's backed similar plans.
He
He's
has.
backed going into the Constitution and changing the flat tax, but there just really wasn't time for something like that. But I think it was really surprising that there wasn't any relief for lower income folks in this bill. I saw it as a glaring omission because Quinn has really spoken up about that.
He did,
Yeah.
and when he's been trying for 2 years to get a tax hike, and when he first came in, as Chris said, he had these sort of safety nets for the poor and for lower income people. A flat rate tax by definition is regressive, and obviously a higher flat rate tax is more regressive. This is going to hit the figure that keeps getting bandied about is that if you have a taxable income of $40,000, that's an $800 increase in your taxes. That's a pretty big hit for somebody who makes $40,000.
Indeed. Mike, I'd like to get back to something you were talking about, expanding the tax base to services. Why would that be more agreeable, or why is that something that might be better for the state?
Well, people don't like any taxes. I don't particularly like to pay them, but we do like services, and we hope to have a good education system. A service tax, I think, would be more agreeable, let's say, than what happened on the income tax, at least raising it as much as possible, because a service tax or a sales tax is a consumption tax. And in some ways, I think it is less regressive than a sales tax on goods. If I buy a calculator, I pay a sales tax on it in Illinois. If I hire an accountant, to do my taxes for me, and I do, by the way, I don't pay a tax on that. If I buy a shirt, I pay a tax. But if I have that shirt dry cleaned, I don't pay a tax. So I think there's a matter of equity here, and the Illinois economy has shifted significantly from a manufacturing to a service economy. We're not taxing an area of strong growth in this state. And by the way, retirement income is another area of strong growth, and we're not taxing those areas.
Now, Republicans often argue that that will chase people out of the state, that people won't want to stay in Illinois. Is that a worry
Well,
on the retirement income?
I'd like to know what the Republicans propose. What is their solution? I worked for a Republican governor. You alluded to that.
Who also faced a budget crisis of his own.
Yeah, and, what are they going to cut? They talk about cutting. They talk about freezes. Okay, what is the specific impact of what they're talking about? I don't think they've been constructive, generally.
Well, there wasn't one
in
vote
this
from the
process.
Republicans
No.
on the tax hike.
No, I
In
think,
favor.
well, I think a lot of Republicans were praying it would pass, and they voted no.
Well,
But
probably. They have vendors in schools that are waiting for their money in their districts just like everyone else.
Yeah,
so.
and they'll take credit for the schools getting taken care of, or at least they'll get less heat at home because the schools are being taken care of. But I haven't seen that they've been willing to step up. And I don't say that as a Democrat partisan. I worked for a Republican governor. But the fact of the matter is, the best approach to a long-term solution would be a bipartisan approach. And for that to happen, I think the Republicans are going to have to acknowledge we do need to raise revenue as well as look at spending.
Well, I think it was a really good point Representative Harris made on the floor during the debate for the tax vote. He listed off a multitude of state agencies that you could completely cut their budget, and that still wouldn't make up for the budget
figure
deficit.
I always like to go with is that the entire state payroll is $4 billion. You could fire everyone from the governor to the janitors, and you've only solved a third of the problem.
But on the flip side, Republicans have argued a lot that Democrats are having trouble with saying no to things, and I would say that's a pretty fair argument as well.
I don't disagree with that either. I mean, look, both parties are responsible. And I think I can make an argument that the Democrats have had control of the show for 8 years, and they may be more responsible. But the Republicans are not without responsibility here, and what I would like to see is for both parties to work together to come up with reasonable long-term solutions to really a budget and tax structure that is out of whack.
And they've shown that they could do it during this session. They passed some Medicaid reforms that would save the state, I believe it's $750 million over 5 years, which I thought was a surprisingly low figure for the Republicans to accept. And they didn't really trim eligibility with the exception of the All Kids program. They lopped off anybody who made, I believe, more than $66,000 a year.
And they have some time to find
Right.
alternatives.
And they have
as
some
well.
time to find alternatives. And you talked with the Minority Leader, Tom Cross, after the session was over, and he thought that was a very good bill, even though it didn't save probably what I think they thought they could save. They used to bandy about numbers like, we can save $1 billion a year on Medicaid. Well, now you're saving not even $1 billion over 5 years, and they went along with that. So I kind of think it shows, that their rhetoric about cutting their way out of this doesn't really match reality or even what they agree to in bipartisan negotiations.
Well, another aspect of this budget plan that ended up falling to the wayside was property tax relief, which would have basically equated to people who own property and pay property tax getting a check in the mail each year. I think President Cullerton estimated it would be around $325. Everyone would get the same check That ended
Well,
up
not
being
everyone.
dropped.
Not if you're a
Well,
renter.
yes, not if you're a renter. That
My
ended
income
up-
taxes go up, but I
Yes.
don't.
That ended
have a house.
up that ended up being dropped off the plan. The money is supposedly promised to go to education. The money that would have gone to that, we'll see how that pans out. But Quinn ran on a 1% tax increase for education with possibly some property tax relief. So
Well, the
this
cigarette
plan,
tax fell apart
Yeah.
too, and that was another thing that was going to fund education. It was a rather ugly way to pass a tax increase. I mean, we saw this whole thing on the very last day, and the property tax thing that you mentioned and the cigarette tax in the last couple of days were what collapsed and I guess lost a lot of the support from lawmakers who had been told, look, if you support this, we're going to bolster the schools too, and that didn't come through. He's going to have to do something with that, but you know, the fact is he's got a little breathing room now with this tax, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if both the property tax measure and the cigarette tax come back when they come back. I mean, you know, later this month.
I think if we're going to talk about real property tax relief in the state, it isn't a check every year out of the state treasury for X amount. That doesn't stop local governments and schools from asking for more money. I think we need to look at this in a very broad context. And property tax relief, if it comes at all, is going to come by shifting costs for items that we pay for out of property taxes to another tax, state tax more than likely. And at the local level, citizens holding local government and their elected officials, school officials and others, accountable for how the money is spent and paying more attention to how it is spent. A check in the mail, it just isn't going to cut it.
It seemed awfully gimmicky.
Yeah.
It was totally gimmicky, yeah.
how hard is this going to hurt Quinn next time if he does run for re-election? He did, in some people's eyes, break some campaign promises with this.
I think Kevin's point about the election is really interesting because in 2 years, a third of the Senate or is it all the Senate, Mike? Or I can't remember.
All the
All the
Senate.
Senate.
The
The whole Senate is up, and so is the entire House. So I suspect that this was probably the best time of any to do it because we're 2 years away from the election, and the next time people have a ballot, there's a guy named Barack Obama who'll be on the ballot, and he's a Democrat. So he may have some coattails, and the Speaker and the President of the Senate may have figured that he might mitigate their losses in 2 years. In
Well,
I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
know. Well, I'm just going to say, when we come down to it, who was Quinn going to lose with this that he hadn't lost already in 2 years of saying we need a tax hike? I think
Right.
his real danger now was to continue to look ineffective and not do something. So
And I
if
think
he
a
could-
lot of folks realized if he got a tax hike, he was probably signing it, and he kind of challenged people at his press conference to, well, you try to pass something like this to the
Yeah.
General Assembly and see what you end up with. In the last minutes of the show, I'd like to talk a little bit about legislators making history by voting to abolish the death penalty in Illinois. Quinn has not signed it yet. He's pretty coy about what he's going to do in the end. Chris, would you like to talk a little bit about
Yeah, one of the real
what you
interesting
think on that?
One of the interesting wrinkles on that is that it would not clear death row. There are 15 inmates still on death row, and they would not be grandfathered in, I guess, basically on that. So I don't know how that really affects the governor's decision. I think that maybe that mitigates the whole "you're soft on crime" argument that someone could make against him. But basically, what the bill does is it abolishes the death penalty for anybody else who ever commits a crime. Again, should he sign it? There's a lot of, it was probably one of the more emotional and one of the better debates you've seen on the floor of the General Assembly. I think everybody kind of spoke from their heart, and I think it was a surprising vote in some ways, just because it didn't seem like that was on the front burner this spring. And then it kind of materialized during the November veto session and had a life of its own.
Well, not just the front burner of the legislature. I'm frankly a little stunned that they did this. I'm still trying to figure out how they reached critical mass on an issue that wasn't pressing. We weren't going to execute an innocent person while you've got this moratorium in place. Most of the public's kind of ambivalent about this. Maybe it's just a testament to the lobbying that was going on. But I think in terms of good government, you could also make the case that if you've got this law on the books that nobody in the real world ever intends to use again, which I think is what we're looking at here, maybe you do have a responsibility to be honest and say, no, we're not a death penalty state anymore.
Mike, what's your take on it?
Well, it is interesting that this did get passed. When you think about it, the current situation in Illinois is very convenient for politicians.
Very.
They could say, I'm for the death penalty, and yet with the moratorium, nobody was being put to death. So, this was one of those situations, like others, where politicians could have it both ways. They try to on a number of issues. So I was surprised to see it gain the momentum it did, although I've had the sense, and probably all of us had that sense in the last few weeks, that there was a very real chance that it could get done, the repeal could get done.
I think a lot of legislators, and one of them, Susana Mendoza of Chicago, talked about it, being a proponent of the death penalty, but then seeing our history where we've had, I believe, 20 inmates exonerated. We've only executed 12 since death penalty became legal again in the 70s. So that kind of tells you that, Illinois has not done a very good job at administering justice there.
And you're never going to have a situation, even with advances in technology, where you can say 100% for sure you're never going to execute an innocent person. So the policy issue really becomes, are you willing to execute an innocent person every once in a while when the system fails in order to execute people who aren't innocent?
Well, we have had an awfully dubious history with the death penalty in Illinois. I've been looking over the last few weeks, and it seems like we've been searching for ways to administer the death penalty and never really settled on something that worked. We've been working on reforms for years and years and never really gotten there. So the General Assembly has started its new 2-year session. And just real quick, in the last minute, I'd like to go around and have each of you say what you think will be some of the big issues or what you think will be really interesting in the new session. Chris?
Redistricting. Redistricting is going to be the thing we pay attention to going down the stretch once the complete census numbers come in, and that'll be a big fight. And the Democrats clearly have the advantage at this point. They have both houses of the legislature. They have the governorship, so they control the process.
Okay.
Gaming expansion, cigarette tax, slots at the horse tracks, anything that they can do to get more revenue. I think the realization is going to set in pretty quickly, if it hasn't already, that all they've really done with this tax hike is to stop the bleeding, and they're probably going to need more.
Mike, about 10 seconds.
Well, I think my colleagues here have covered it well.
All right, well, I'd like to thank my guests, Mike Lawerence, Kevin McDermott, and Chris Wetterich, for joining me this week. As I said, we've started a new legislative session, so check back every week on CapitolVIew, and we'll let you know what's going on. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn. Thank you for joining us.